Welcome, fellow true crime and mystery enthusiasts. This is Plague Doctor presenting to you part 1 of the Nameless Killer Iceberg Explained series. A huge thanks to Reddit user Gangstar for Life, who created and shared this iceberg with the Iceberg Charts subreddit. It was incredibly well put together and really interesting to research. Today I'm going to be covering the top 2 tiers of the iceberg, and while some of these are going to be familiar to just about anyone interested in true crime, I tried to include some interesting facts that may not be quite as well known about these nameless killers. I do want to caution you that throughout this video we'll be discussing some extremely sensitive and disturbing topics given the nature of the iceberg, so viewer discretion is definitely advised. Also, due to the algorithm, I'm going to have to refer to certain things in vague terms. It's not to make light of anything or gloss over anything, but at the same time, I don't want to get too explicit and wind up having this video restricted. With all that said, let's jump into the Obscure Nameless Killer Iceberg. Jack the Ripper. This is definitely the most well-known out of the nameless serial killers, so it makes sense that Jack would be the first on this iceberg. Unless you've been under a rock your entire life, you've probably heard Jack the Ripper referenced in media, video games, books, movies about 1,000 times over. There's been endless speculation about the Ripper's identity ever since he began terrorizing Victorian London in the late 1800s. While not necessarily the most prolific serial killer, Jack the Ripper, also known as Leather Apron and the Whitechapel Murderer, has left a deeper mark on popular culture than probably any other killer out there. With so much information on this killer, I'm not going to go into depth, but I'm just going to cover the basics and some of the more interesting facts about the killings for the sake of getting through the top layer of the iceberg. The Ripper murders began in the year 1888 in Whitechapel, one of the poorest areas of London on the east side of the city. There were 5 killings officially attributed to the Ripper, and each of them occurred within a 1-mile radius of the others. The first murder took place on August 7th, 1888, and the last in early November of the same year, yet, in a little over 2 months, the killer would become one of the most infamous figures in modern history. So, how did the Ripper get his name? On September 27th, a letter known as the Dear Boss letter was sent to the Central News Agency of London, the author of which claimed to be the Whitechapel murderer himself. He signed the letter as Jack the Ripper, so that's how the name came to be. The letter reads as follows. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and said to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands, curse it. No luck yet, they say I'm a doctor now, haha. Yes, that is literally the letter they published in the newspaper. If you're thinking the Ripper sounds a lot like a shit poster, you wouldn't be the only one. At first, journalists and the police both believed the letter to be a hoax, and there were certainly plenty of those circulating in the wake of the murders. Many decades later, in 1931, a journalist would confess that he and a colleague had written the letter along with several other prominent hoax communications in order to promote newspaper sales. In addition to being from the same geographic location, all 5 of the Ripper's victims were sex workers who were frequently the targets of brutal violence and sometimes murdered due to their social status. For the most part, the murders weren't publicized, and the victims, like the trade itself, were quietly swept under the rug to be ignored by the rest of society. The Whitechapel murders were different. For one thing, they didn't appear related to the gangs who often extorted the women for money, making up the majority of these tragic cases. For another, the women weren't just killed, they were butchered, disemboweled, and mutilated. The Ripper removed various organs from the bodies, their uteruses in particular, which suggests it wasn't just a matter of the killer choosing the most vulnerable victims, but also having a particular hatred for them because they were women. According to most researchers, Mary Jane Kelly was the Ripper's final victim, but there are quite a few other killings that some have attributed to Jack the Ripper as well. Because the bodies were largely not mutilated in the same singular way as the Ripper's canonical victims, these links are considered tentative at best. Despite having all of Scotland Yard on the hunt and the fact that the Whitechapel murders have continued to capture the public interest for well over a century, the identity of Jack the Ripper is still unknown. Not for a lack of speculation either. Over 100 potential suspects have been put forth over the years, ranging from local physicians to members of the royal family. Everything from the killer's gender to profession have been a source of continued speculation, but these matters, much like the identity of the Whitechapel murderer themselves, remain a mystery. The Doodler. As I've come to realize during the course of researching this iceberg, there are only 3 types of names given to nameless killers. 1. Cool, badass sounding names like Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer. 2. Boring and generic names like the Long Island Serial Killer or the I-70 Killer. And 3. Names that just sound absolutely ridiculous. I think it's pretty obvious which category the Doodler falls into. Despite having what's probably the silliest name on the iceberg, the Doodler is potentially one of the more prolific serial killers, with as many as 16 murders attributed to him and another 3 victims who fortunately managed to escape and survive their encounters. Now, you're probably a little afraid to ask how the Doodler got his name, but it's actually pretty straightforward. He liked to sketch his victims prior to killing them. As a matter of fact, he used his artistic talents to connect with his victims, showing them flattering doodles of themselves before propositioning them to leave the location of their initial encounter. The Doodler hunted for his victims at bars and gay nightclubs in San Francisco between January 1974 and September 1975. All 5 of his known victims were gay men ranging between the ages of 25 to 66, so we have another case of a serial killer targeting members of a vulnerable group that were more or less alienated in some way from society. This was already at a time when gay rights were even more contested than they are today, and having such brutal crimes targeting gay men in the city that was considered by many to be a sanctuary resulted in a lot of turmoil and fear. Unfortunately, to this day, there remains no justice for the victims and their families, and it is believed that stigma against gay men led to the investigation not being as comprehensive as it should have been at the time. Despite having a sketch of what the killer is believed to look like, along with an age progression image, the Doodler's identity remains unknown. The Atlanta Ripper. On May 28, 1911, the body of a young woman named Belle Walker was found in Atlanta, a mere 25 yards away from her home. Reported missing by her sister, Belle's body was discovered with her throat cut by a mystery assailant. Belle was the 8th victim in a string of brutal killings, all African-American women living in the Atlanta area, but she was the first to actually gain any widespread media attention. The Atlanta Ripper would go on to murder nearly 20 women, each mutilated in some fashion. Like the London Ripper, the Atlanta Ripper chose victims who were easy targets due to their vulnerable place in society. While the identity of the Atlanta Ripper, like all the killers on the iceberg, is still unknown, there are those who managed to escape an encounter with him. Emma Lou was a 20-year-old Atlanta woman who became fearful something had happened to her mother when she didn't return from a trip to the market. Emma was already aware of the killings in the area, so she went out in search for her mother, only to encounter the Ripper, who, unknown to her at the time, had killed her mother a mere few meters away. Emma recounted the chilling words the killer spoke to her that night. "Don't be afraid, I never hurt girls like you." He uttered those words right before stabbing Emma in the back and laughed as she ran. Fortunately, Emma was able to escape and save her own life, but her mother became one of the Ripper's many victims. Another young woman named Mary Adele was leaving her place of employment when she was approached by the Atlanta Ripper. She was able to flee and call her employer for help, a man named W.M. Selker. Selker was armed when he found the killer in an alleyway, but the Ripper managed to escape, and unfortunately, the encounter didn't yield any significant findings for the investigation to go off of. His identity continues to remain a mystery. The Zodiac Killer. After Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer is the most infamous nameless killer out there, and definitely the most famous serial killer in the United States. The films Zodiac and Dirty Harry, which I highly recommend watching for anyone interested in the subject, were both based off of real-life events surrounding the killings. Like Jack the Ripper, 5 deaths were canonically attributed to the Zodiac between 1968 and 1969, but the killer himself claimed to have killed 37 people. Like the Doodler, he targeted victims in the San Francisco Bay Area, and 2 of his victims were young couples. The 5th was a male cab driver, and another 2 victims actually escaped from the Zodiac and lived to tell the tale. As for where the Zodiac Killer got his name, it actually came from one of the letters the killer himself sent to the San Francisco Examiner, which began with, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking," so pretty straightforward. This actually wasn't the first letter the killer sent, though. 3 letters that were pretty much identical were sent to 3 separate newspapers in the San Francisco area on the same day. The writer of the letters took credit for 2 of the killings at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. Additionally, he included 1/3 of a cipher in each letter, probably in hopes of forcing the papers to publish all 3. Eventually, this did happen, but the San Francisco Chronicle would be the first to publish its 1/3 of the cryptogram, along with a challenge from the Vallejo police chief to send more information, proving the writer of the letters was actually the killer. And the Zodiac delivered. In the letter that followed to the San Francisco Examiner, the killer would not only name himself the Zodiac, but also provide numerous details of his 3 previous victims, proving that he was indeed the killer. The final deciphered letter, which contained 408 symbols, was actually solved by a high school teacher and his wife by the names of Donald and Betty Hardin. The letter reads as follows: I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all the I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or atop my collectiog of slaves for my afterlife. And a bunch of gibberish, or the name of a demon. No one really could figure it out. You would think someone who speaks in ciphers could be bothered to check for typos, but I digress. The first line of the deciphered letter references the short story The Most Dangerous Game by author Richard Connell, in which a big game hunter finds himself shipwrecked on a small Caribbean island, only to learn that the hunter has become the hunted. The killer would go on to send more letters, many of which included puzzles and ciphers, one of which wasn't actually solved until 51 years later. In fact, it's the interactive nature of the killer's communications with the media and public at large that has been credited with a massive wave of public interest over the years. At the time, many people would be critical of the papers choosing to publish the letters, considering that it's pretty clear the killer got enjoyment out of the attention. To their credit, the Zodiac did threaten to kill numerous people if the letters weren't published. Unlike most of the killers on the Iceberg, there was a prominent suspect by the name of Arthur Lee Allen who was named by police during the investigation. While he was interviewed by police, no conclusive evidence was ever found to connect him to the murders. To this day, his identity remains a mystery and the case remains open, often considered a gateway into true crime. The Long Island Serial Killer. The Long Island serial killer was actually given many different pseudonyms, including the acronymous title of Lisk or Lisk, as well as the Craigslist Ripper and the Gilgo Beach Killer. If there is one thing that researching true crime will teach you, it's to never, ever, under any circumstances, go to the beach at night. Or at all, just to be safe. As one of the more recent killers on the tip of the iceberg, the Long Island serial killer is believed to have killed between 10 and 16 people during the years 2010 and 2011. 4 of the victims' remains were found incredibly close to each other near Gilgo Beach in December 2010, while 4 more sets of victims would be discovered in March and April of 2011, all located on or near Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach. All the bodies were found within 2 miles of the first set of remains back in 2010. Like Jack the Ripper, the Long Island serial killer primarily targeted sex workers, but through a far more modern medium. He would hunt his victims through their postings on Craigslist and arrange meetups that ultimately led to their murders. There were other potential victims of the Long Island serial killer, including a couple of women who remain unidentified to this day, but there haven't been any conclusive links between those deaths and the serial killer. Although several suspects have been named in the killings, the Long Island serial killer was never found, but it is believed that he may have law enforcement knowledge which enabled him to kill so many people without ever getting caught. Bible John. Bible John was a serial killer in Glasgow, Scotland. Like the Zodiac Killer, he operated between the years 1968 and 1969. The serial killer targeted a very specific set of victims, 3 young brunette women between the ages of 25 and 32. All 3 women were leaving the Barrowland Ballroom prior to being strangled to death with ligatures, and there were several other odd similarities between the murders as well. Each of the victims was menstruating at the time of the murder, and their handbags were either missing or had contents stolen out of them. The killer gets his name from his repeated quotations from the Bible and rants about adultery during his conversation with the one witness to emerge from an encounter with him alive. This information surfaced from Jean McLaughlin, the sister of Bible John's 3rd and final victim. Jean and her sister Helen encountered him at the Barrowland Ballroom in late October 1969. The sisters left the ballroom and hailed a taxi with the killer, and Jean says he quoted frequently from the Old Testament, specifically the stories of Moses, during the ride. He also called the ballroom a, quote, adulterous den of iniquity, and was particularly obsessed with the idea of married women visiting the ballroom to cheat on their husbands. While Jean was dropped off by the cab once it arrived at her home, her sister Helen would continue riding with the killer to the events that ultimately led to her death. Jean described the killer as a well-dressed man between the ages of 25 and 30 with reddish hair and a tall, slender build. Based on her account, officials produced a composite drawing that led to several potential suspects being named at the time, but no conclusive proof was ever found to link them to any of the murders. Despite being such a cold case, there has been a recent surge in interest in the Bible John murders with a 2022 BBC documentary, as well as the Daily Record releasing new photo fits or reconstructed images of what the killer is believed to have looked like, both at the time of the murders and what he would look like today. As a result of the recent news, many tips have come in about the potential identity of the killer, with many different informants being insistent that they know who he was, but only time will tell if this mystery will finally be solved. The 2 remaining nameless killers on the Iceberg are Mr. Cruel and Charlie Chopoff, but due to the sensitive and disturbing nature of these crimes, I'm not really able to go into them on YouTube, and I would encourage anyone researching them to be cautious and do so at your own risk. And with that concludes the first tier in the Nameless Killers Iceberg. Up next, we're looking at some more obscure cases with the second tier. The Frankfurt Slasher. Starting off, we have the Frankfurt Slasher, a serial killer who was active in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the neighborhood of Frankfurt from the years 1985 to 1990. The Frankfurt Slasher is believed to be responsible for 9 interconnected deaths in the 5-year period. Each of the victims were women who had been brutally assaulted and stabbed dozens of times prior to their deaths. The victims were all either women who were known to struggle with substance abuse or who spent a lot of time in areas that were known for drug activity, which is thought to be one of the reasons why the Philadelphia police didn't investigate the matter as thoroughly as many believe they should have. At first glance, this might seem like it doesn't belong on the Nameless Killers iceberg because a man named Leonard Christopher was ultimately charged and convicted of first-degree murder in the case of Carol Dowd, one of the Frankfurt Slash's victims. However, the evidence linking Christopher to Dowd's death was circumstantial at best, and police were never able to link him to the other 8 murders. It's also worth noting that several eyewitnesses reported seeing the victims with a middle-aged white man shortly prior to their deaths, which is a description that Christopher did not match. It's widely believed that Christopher, who died in prison during a life sentence, was wrongly convicted, and the true Frankfurt Slasher remains on the loose. The Eastbound Strangler. The Eastbound Strangler, also referred to as the Atlantic City serial killer, is a killer who's responsible for the murders of 4 different women in New Jersey in 2006. All 4 women were sex workers, and their bodies were found together in a drainage ditch filled with water by the Golden Key Motel. The bodies were lined up approximately 6 feet apart from each other, and were all determined to have been strangled. While police interviewed several suspects they believed may have been linked to the killings, ultimately no one was charged and no concrete evidence was found to link them. It was even believed that the killer could be connected to the Long Island serial killer, but that ultimately turned out to be a false lead. The Honolulu Strangler. The Honolulu Strangler is a serial killer who killed 5 women in Hawaii from 1985 to 1986. While it's often reported that the Honolulu Strangler was Hawaii's first serial killer, he was actually the second known serial killer in the state, but he is the first and only one that hasn't been identified to this day. The Strangler's victims ranged in age from 17 to 36, and all 5 of the women were found to have been brutally assaulted, then strangled with their arms bound behind their back. Something that makes this case unique is the fact that the killer didn't seem to premeditate his crimes. He simply spotted women who were alone and chose to pursue them at the time, which is why authorities believe he may have lived or even worked near the scene of the crimes. A significant breakthrough was made in the case when eyewitnesses reported seeing a man near the car of Linda Pacey, one of the final 2 victims in the murders. The witness reports led to the arrest of a man named Howard Gay, and he was said to have engaged in bondage activity by his girlfriend as well as his ex-wife. His girlfriend also reported to police that he went missing on the nights the murders were said to have occurred after she and he fought. Sometime later, a woman would report that she had seen Pacey on the night of her murder with a man. When asked to pick the suspect out of a lineup, she identified Howard Gay. However, she refused to testify due to concerns about her safety. As a result, there was never any concrete proof linking Gay to the murders, and after he died in 2003, it's believed to be a mystery that may continue to go unsolved forever. The I-70 Killer. The I-70 Killer is a serial killer who murdered 6 people in the Midwest during the spring of 1992. 5 out of 6 of his victims were women, and all 6 were store clerks working off of Interstate 70. The murders spanned several states, including Kansas, Missouri, and Indiana. The killer primarily targeted young women with long, dark hair whom he believed to be working alone, and each one was shot in the back of the head. In the double murder of Patricia Magers and Patricia Smith, 2 employees who were working together after hours at a bridal shop in Wichita, Kansas, it's believed the killer thought there would be only 1 woman present. However, the employees were staying after hours because a client was scheduled to come in to pick up a cummerbund. When the killer entered the shop, they assumed it was the customer they were waiting on, but it wasn't. Not long after the killer had killed the 2 employees, the customer who was originally supposed to come in arrived and happened to see the killer still in the shop with a gun. Although the killer pressured the customer to go into the back with him at gunpoint, the customer refused, which is ultimately the decision that led to his life being spared. The man fled the shop and was so shaken by the event that he actually failed to report it to authorities for a full hour after it had taken place. Ultimately, his description wouldn't be enough to generate any significant leads. In the case of Michael McCown, the killer's only male victim, it's believed that Michael was chosen by mistake due to the fact that he was working in his mother's ceramic shop. The store was called Sylvia's Ceramics, which probably gave him the idea that there would be a single woman working inside as an easy target, since it was clearly a small business. Michael also had long hair worn in a ponytail, and he was shot from behind, so it's believed that the killer may have actually thought he was a woman at the time of the murder. While the I-70 killer was believed to be connected to several other murders taking place in Texas and Indiana, there was never enough evidence to conclusively link him to them. The Connecticut River Valley Serial Killer. The Connecticut River Valley serial killer, also known as the New Hampshire serial killer, the Valley Killer, and the Kellyville Killer, committed a series of brutal stabbings in Claremont, New Hampshire and the Connecticut River Valley in the 1980s. At least 6 women were murdered by the Valley Killer, all of whom had similar stab wounds when their bodies were found. It's believed the stabbings were the cause of all 6 deaths, although in the case of 2 of the victims who were found together, the bodies had decomposed to the point where it was difficult to determine the cause of death conclusively. In addition to the 6 confirmed killings, there are 3 other female victims authorities believe may also have been victims of the Connecticut River Valley Killer due to their bodies being found in locations near to the others and with similar stab wounds. As is often the case, the only concrete information we have on the killer comes from one of his would-be victims who actually managed to escape the encounter. A 22-year-old woman by the name of Jane Borowski was parked outside of a convenience store on her way home from a fair. The convenience store was closed, and she says that a man approached her car asking about a payphone outside the store prior to pulling her out of her vehicle through the window. A struggle ensued in which the man made up strange accusations of her getting into a fight with and attacking his girlfriend, and he then proceeded to stab her 27 times. The killer left Borowski at the scene and then drove away in the Jeep Wagoneer he was driving, but the woman, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, incredibly managed to drive herself to the house of a nearby friend. On the way, she recognized that the same Jeep was following her, but it eventually turned away when she arrived at her friend's house, and the home's occupants emerged to help her. Even though Borowski sustained numerous life-threatening injuries, she and her baby both miraculously survived. Although she was able to describe her killer and several details about his car, authorities were still unable to capture the Connecticut River Valley Killer. Borowski is generally believed to be the killer's 7th and final attack, although one of his rumored potential victims was killed years later in July of 1989. However, authorities weren't able to link this killing to the others officially. The New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. Between 1988 and 1989, the New Bedford Highway Killer would kill at least 9 women from Bedford, Massachusetts, between the ages of 19 and 36. The victims' bodies were left at various points along Route 140, although they were all abducted from New Bedford, which is where the name comes from. Each of the victims were either sex workers, women who struggled with drug addiction, or both, making them easy targets for the ruthless killer. Although there are only 9 deaths officially attributed to the New Bedford Highway Killer, there were 11 disappearances in 1988 that were believed to have been connected to him. The remaining 2 women were never found. There were several major suspects in the killing, including one man who spent only a year in prison after being convicted of 17 assaults on sex workers in the area. The man was found dead only 1 month after his release from prison, which has led authorities to believe that he may have not alived himself as a result of guilt for the killings he was never convicted of. But despite him being named as the number one suspect in the case, there was no actual evidence that he was linked to the murders. Another primary suspect was a New Bedford attorney who was convicted of murdering another woman who allegedly threatened to expose his drug use. But as is the case of the first suspect, there was no evidence linking him to the other murders at all. A third suspect by the name of Daniel Tavares Jr. actually claimed to be the New Bedford highway killer in a letter he wrote to a prison employee while serving out a sentence for murdering his own mother. In addition to killing his mother, Tavares was also convicted of murdering 3 other people, including a woman he accurately reported as being buried in his own backyard a mere 1 mile away from his house. This makes him a substantially more compelling suspect, but ultimately, he was never conclusively linked to the New Bedford highway killings either, and the killer's identity remains a mystery. The Axeman of New Orleans. The Axeman of New Orleans is the name given to a killer who haunted the Big Easy and became one of the city's most infamous figures. What makes this case so intriguing is that it's been steeped in rumors of the paranormal and supernatural, to which New Orleans is certainly no stranger. In fact, the mark he left on the culture of New Orleans is so significant that there's actually a form of jazz known as Axeman's Jazz that became popular in the city. So, what makes the Axeman of New Orleans so mysterious? For a long time, authorities had no idea how he was actually entering his victims' homes. It wasn't until much later that they learned he had drilled small holes in the walls and doors of the houses that seemed impossible for any human being to pass through. As for how he managed to fit through those holes, well, that's just another of the many aspects of this case that remains shrouded in mystery. The murders took place between May of 1918 and October of 1919, but to this day the killer has never been identified. As you've probably figured out by now, most of the victims were killed with an axe. In most cases, one that belonged to the victims themselves. As grisly as the murder scenes were, the Axeman somehow managed to leave without so much of a trace as to his identity. Aside from the axe wounds themselves, there was never any sign of assault, and no items were taken from the victims' homes, ruling out any motivation of robbery. The Axeman particularly targeted Italian-American immigrants, particularly Italian women, who faced significant obstacles and prejudice at the time, which has led authorities and researchers alike to believe the attacks were motivated by the victims' ethnicity. Quite a few of the Axeman's victims actually did survive, but despite this, the police were still unable to identify the killer. Another noteworthy aspect of the case was the now infamous letter addressed and written as follows.Hot as Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, the Axeman. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible. Even as the ether that surrounds your earth, I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you, Orleanians, and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe besmeared with the blood of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed in fact or realm of fancy. As you might imagine, the letter sparked a firestorm of public attention and resulted in something of a jazz renaissance in the city. Establishments throughout all of New Orleans threw a party on March 19th, the date the Axeman promised to, quote, pass over the city, blaring jazz the entire night through. True to his word, the Axeman spared any of his would-be victims that night. Many months later, in October of the same year, the axe murders ceased as suddenly as they had begun, and no one was any the wiser to the Axeman's identity. The Servant Girl Annihilator. The Servant Girl Annihilator, also known as the Midnight Assassin and the Austin Axe Murderer, was a serial killer operating in Austin, Texas between the years 1884 and 1885. Just 3 years prior to the first killing of Jack the Ripper in Whitechapel, London. He was America's first serial killer, a term that didn't even exist at the time. There was even a widely circulated theory that the Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were one and the same, which we'll get into a bit later. The Servant Girl Annihilator is believed to be responsible for 8 separate axe murders as well. There were 7 female victims, 1 male victim, and another 6 women and 2 men who were attacked but managed to survive their encounters. The killer's MO involved attacking his victims in their own beds while they were sleeping and often dragging them outside to meet their grisly fates. The killer's methods were especially brutal and, at the time, in the relatively safe and burgeoning metropolis of Austin, unheard of. Despite his name, only 3 of the Servant Girl Annihilator's victims were actually servant girls. One of the earlier murders was of a younger couple, which was arguably the most gruesome attack of all. In fact, one of the victims was described in the Austin Daily Statesman as having been, quote, almost beaten into a jelly. Due to discrepancies in the methods of the killings, including one victim whose arms had been pinned with timber, police began to speculate that there could be more than one killer at work. One of the most promising suspects turned out to be a man by the name of Maurice, a cook working at an Austin motel. In a letter, Maurice announced his intentions to leave Austin for London a mere few weeks after the last of the servant girl murders. The link was further compounded by the fact that the murders all took place within the same neighborhood as the hotel where he worked. Considering his intended destination, rumors that the Midnight Assassin and Jack the Ripper were one and the same flourished, but the theory wasn't limited to Maurice. A Liverpool merchant named James Maybrick was also theorized as a potential suspect. This theory is based on a journal that allegedly belonged to Maybrick, in which he signs off as Jack the Ripper. In the journal, he mentions being in Austin at the time the murders took place. Maybrick also died of arsenic poisoning later, not long after the last of the Whitechapel murders in May 1889. It's believed that his wife may have been the one who poisoned him. While many other suspects have been posited over the years, the true identity of the Servant Girl Annihilator and the true nature of his potential ties to the Whitechapel murders remains a mystery. That's it for the second tier of the Nameless Killers Iceberg. I want to thank you so much for watching the video, and I hope that you're looking forward to tiers 3 and 4 as much as I am. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel and helps me know that you want me to keep making content like this. This is Plague Doctor signing off. Take care, and definitely stay away from beaches at night.